Hi, welcome to In Focus, brought to you from the Up North Media Center. I'm your host, Kimberli Bindschatel. With me is my co-host, Anthony Weber. And today we have a couple of special guests with us back once again to talk politics. John Zachman, thanks for coming.
Glad to be here.
And Brandon Everest, a regular on our show. And we are kind of continuing the conversation from a show we did back in February. We titled The Rise of the Unexpected Candidate. Back then it was still the primary, so a lot has happened since then. And a lot that's still been a little mind-boggling. We've been chatting before the show, getting the microphones ready, and so many different directions and ideas to discuss. I want to start with this. So. Earlier today, I saw a meme on Facebook that said something around the lines of Trump and Hillary are like a couple of parents in the midst of a divorce, and all we want is to go live with grandma. And I think that really does kind of sum up the feeling in the country. Am I right? John, can you speak to that first? Like, what is going on? Maybe give us a big picture.
I guess with that metaphor, I would say the kids are angrier than that. And that I don't know who they want to go live with. They're probably rejecting mom and dad at this point. But yeah, so I guess I see a lot of anger in the electorate. And, you know, part of that, I think, some of the drivers here in terms of that anger, in terms of that disillusion, I would look at economics. I would look at the distribution of income in this country and the trends there, because those trends are not positive. If you're in the lowest quintile or the second lowest quintile, things are getting worse for you. So I see huge economic drivers there. I also see a lot of unhappiness with our political system for not producing results. And not producing change that people can understand. I feel like your average voter feels like nothing's being done, and that the gridlock in Washington, D.C. is having a real effect on their lives, and there's an absence of leadership to get rid of that gridlock. You know, as a political scientist, I can talk to you about structural factors in terms of that gridlock and the design of our system, but I think your average voter is going to tune out when I start to say those things. It doesn't, you know, so what? Leadership means taking a broken system and fixing it, and I don't think that they see that coming from the parties right now. So I see a lot of anger. This is very unprecedented. The Republican Party clearly hasn't played their hand correctly over the last decade or so, because the Republican Party is in very, very serious trouble right now, and it's. You know, again, as I teach American politics, I've never had a semester like this. I've never had a semester where I'm constantly telling my students the Republican Party has lost control, and they so have lost control. And I don't know what they're going to do as they try to rebuild. You know, I'm not going out on a limb saying that. That's the Republican elites have recognized that, and the problem with the Republican elites that so know that they've lost control is they don't know how to reconnect with the Republican base. I don't really think that they know what the Republican base wants, and I don't think that they really have a programmatic idea of what kinds of policy changes they would introduce to move towards that, towards the base. And so, I mean, one thing we'll have to talk about here is just what the Republican Party is going to do going forward. Yeah, the Democratic Party is a different thing to some extent. Although you have the Bernie supporters are very upset with the Democratic Party that they see as unresponsive to them. And they also are not, I don't think that they're attracted to Hillary Clinton as a candidate. They see her as I think, an outdated candidate. I don't think that they see her addressing, she can't relate to them, is I think part of the problem. And so I think on the Democratic side you have something similar, but it's not at all the same in terms of the extent of the rupture within the Democratic Party. But I do see Bernie Sanders, his supporters being very unhappy with what's going on, and I see that as driving the unhappiness towards Hillary Clinton. I feel that middle-aged and older Democrats are not that unhappy with Hillary Clinton. They're not necessarily that excited about Hillary Clinton, but to some extent, she's been around for so long. If you support her, I mean, you're not going to go skipping down the street, saying this is the best thing ever. So that part of the Democratic Party, I think, is still actually fairly intact. But the younger voters for the Democratic Party are unhappy, and the Republican Party's just a mess.
Fractured.
Yeah.
I want to run with something that you said, and Brandon, I'm curious, what do you think we're learning about the electorate? I mean, you've talked some just about how people are viewing that, but it's been 6 months since we talked. As this has been unfolding and you're reading more and more about what people are saying and whether they're voting for because they like a candidate or because they dislike another, or even discussion of what is it that's making a candidate so appealing to a particular base, what do you think we're learning about the electorate in this election?
It's hard to say, because on the one hand, I think we all have to admit that this electoral season is a bit of an outlier. So to make very long-term, durable judgments about what this means going forward is pretty hard. And I think anybody in the prediction game is probably a little woeful to be engaged in such a thing. But I think what it tells us in this situation, back to the parents, if you had the two least attractive parents possible, I think if anything, you want to run away. And I think that's sort of what's happening. There's sort of a rejection.
We're moving to Canada?
Perhaps, or running away from the establishment party politics as we've understood it. The reality is that the system this time has delivered to us a choice between the two least favorable candidates that we have learned about since polling on these matters began. And so when faced with a forced choice situation between the least favorable candidate and the person who's running a close second there, I think we're learning that the electorate is pretty fed up with that, even though it is a consequence of the system that we have. But I think one of the longer term trends that's happening here is that we know that even though party membership is at not an all-time low, but it is at a low point, and we see independents rising, we know that the electorate is becoming more ideologically divided. And I think that an election like this is going to make that even more pronounced, because when we have this forced choice between the two worst candidates that we can imagine, then it's going to make people sort of retreat to their camps perhaps even more and reject the other. One of the biggest trends that we see is that independents are rising, but they're ideologically dividing themselves. So even though people will say, I'm not a member of a particular party, if their ideology or their values lean in either direction, they're going to go that way, but mostly to reject the other candidate and what they stand for. And in a context like this, I think we're just going to get that doubled down.
So how did these two, the worst possible two candidates, how did they get elected in the primaries then? I understand that's on the party line, the primary elections, but still, it seems on one side there's one reason, and on the other side, we talked a little before the show about that. So on the Republican side, it's almost this whole fractured problem with the way they've been trying to connect with the electorate. And on the other side, what happened there on the other side? How did Hillary get elected if she is the least popular candidate on that side? There was some crookedness maybe going on. That's not quite proven, but
is she just the assumed candidate and so moved in there naturally?
How dare you not? Because she's the next in line?
Well, I can start on this. I certainly don't think that Hillary Clinton is the least popular candidate whatsoever. Hillary Clinton's highly qualified. Yes. Her policy positions are very much established Democratic policy positions that are ultimately, I think, popular amongst Democrats. I think she showed herself to be very capable in the Senate. I think she showed herself to be very capable as Secretary of State. I think that the email thing is a big deal for people that don't like Hillary Clinton to begin with. If she ordered an aide to destroy 33,000 emails because there was evidence that she accepted bribes in those emails, that's obviously a very serious thing. But we have no evidence of that. The only thing we have evidence of is that an aide destroyed 33,000 emails that he was supposed to destroy a year prior to the subpoena. He didn't destroy them, and he destroyed them after the subpoena. That's a serious thing, but at the same point in time, we have no evidence that she ordered that or that she was destroying evidence to cover up wrongdoing. So the people that are really upset about that, I think, are all, if you study politics, so for example, I was teaching today about George W. Bush commuting Scooter Libby's sentence after he leaked Valerie Plame's identity, a CIA operative, right? And you could be very, very upset with George Bush for doing that. This was a CIA operative who was exposed. People were potentially killed by that leak of information by Dick Cheney's chief of staff, right? Did Dick Cheney order that? We don't have any evidence. Obviously, he might have, he may not have, right? So when you look at Hillary Clinton's emails in those contexts, you see that politicians potentially do things that are not good. The evidence that Hillary Clinton did things that are not good is certainly no stronger than that Dick Cheney ordered Scooter Libby to do what I just described, right? And so in terms of Hillary Clinton, I think there's a lot of, we can at some point certainly talk about sexism here, because I think the fact that she is a woman and she has a certain type of very strong personality, right? She is a strong person and a very dominant kind of personality. And as a woman, I think that Americans I think many Americans have a problem with that. In terms of, so with Hillary Clinton, I would very much defend her as being a fairly mainstream Democrat. In terms, and I don't think that the Democrats really rigged anything in her favor. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not surprising that the Democratic Party didn't exactly shine on a Democratic socialist coming in and trying to be their party's candidate. I mean, Bernie Sanders is a wonderful politician, and I think, as far as I can tell, a really neat guy, but he's hardly a Democrat. I mean, he's a Democratic socialist, and he was using the party as his potential, in that way, somewhat similar to Trump. So I don't have a problem with the Democratic Party doing what they did, and I think that Hillary Clinton, her nomination is one thing. I think Donald Trump's nomination is a very different thing.
Can we, as much as I'd like to, but if we could set aside the particulars of the two candidates, I'd like to explore a little bit more what's happening. As you said, the trend, is it a trend? Where are we going from here? But is this all a result of a two-party system? Is it the idea that as a voter, I have a choice between two, period. So I can't think in terms of, well, I like this policy, but over here with this policy, this fits what I think should be done with this policy. And it's almost like these two camps have been created, and therefore it sets us up for a scenario where it is an us against them. And like you said, you grab onto an ideology, and it's almost because I don't want the other one. Is that what we're seeing today? Is it a result of many, many years of this two-party, kind of the structure of the way we elect our officials? Or are there multiple other facets? Are
you saying it tends to be an all or nothing kind of vote, that there's no room for nuance where you can make a distinction between, so this candidate, I like some things but not a lot of things, but because of the system, it's an all or nothing kind of vote? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not sure how else to describe where I was going.
Well, I guess the first thing that leaps to mind is, a two-party system is just one more than a one-party system. And although that gives us a notion of choice, I think that there is an element of, if you only have A or B and you get upset with either one, you only have one other option. So the likelihood that there's going to be an us and them scenario, I think, is very real. How this aligns with the system, well, we're based on majority rule. And one of the things that is difficult in a system like that is that, well, for one, the system is set up to sort of recreate and sustain the two-party model. But we don't have a history of party coalition building, of a multi-party system either. And so then you stack that onto the fact that the primaries are created, that media coverage is done in such a way as to keep people out if they don't achieve a certain threshold. We limit the focus. so that anybody who sort of falls left of center has to go with choice A, and anybody who sort of falls right of center has to go with choice B. I think that sort of creates a sports metaphor here where it is an us against them very easily. In European parliamentary systems and elsewhere in the world, they're very familiar with coalition building. And that means that people who may have varying ideological perspectives will have to join together on particular issues or legislative concerns in order to be able to get things done. We don't have that. And I think that does create a bit of unnecessary or at least predictable animosity.
Do you think this kind of election, that as a result of this, it's possible that we'll start considering more seriously moving to that coalition type of model? Do you think that's on the table at all?
My first response would be no.
Yeah.
One, we have a presidential system as opposed to a parliamentary.
Yeah.
So there's only one president, and that doesn't change. And so that drives you towards two parties for the presidential election. And there's no helping that. In terms of, it would really, the Democrats and the Republicans still have no incentive to go to a multi-party system, because whoever can kind of become the dominant force within the Republican Party has no interest in a multi-party system, because that just would allow I mean, if you had a multi-party system, the Republican Party would fall apart right now, and you'd fundamentally redefine what the Republicans are, and a new party would rise up. A new party of, the base that Donald Trump has, you would have a party around those ideas, because what that party is demanding is largely not a Republican stance. The protectionism, the anger towards the corporate world, they're fundamentally not the Republican Party right there. But to drive that, you'd have to change the electoral system, right, into multi-member districts. And to do that, the Democrats and the Republicans would have to do that. Your average voter, as soon as I start talking about how we might be able to do this, and my students actually, I think, very much like to learn about this, but not all college students are that into American politics and political science, and so, and certainly not all voters are, and so they're not going to make the demand that we switch to a multi-party system. That if we would have evidence of that if this election were highly involved in policy discussions, right, where you had a lot of policy discussions going on, then we could open that can of worms in terms of, but that's not what this is about. So,
do you think it's possible that, considering the conflict within the Republican Party, and even considering, like right now, the evangelical voting base, which is huge for Trump, is remarkably at odds with each other? There appears to be potentially an irredeemable rift that is forming there. Do you think it's possible that even without a formal move toward a third-party system, that we will see out of this election enough momentum for an alternate that 4 years from now we could be seeing a semi-serious contender for president, or at least pushing for, whether it's in states, for House, Senate, all different kinds of levels? Do you think that's a possibility?
I think, to John's point, the odds seem low. The odds seem low, because you also have to think about the donor class too. It simplifies donor streams to only have two options as well. One of the things, and I would argue too, that if we had a multi-party system, that the left would also experience a schism, because there is a big schism between what I would call progressives and liberals in the Democratic side, who would be sort of akin to, we'll say, arch conservatives and more traditionally conservative people on the right side. There's a big rift. So that's why we're seeing historically better performance from Gary Johnson and Jill Stein, because a good number of people from both sides are being peeled away. But between how the party structure debates, the electoral system, the presidential system, the system is pitched in such a way that unless there were throngs of people in the streets demanding something different that compelled the people sitting in legislature now to do something, it's not going to change, and arguably it would create a constitutional crisis, in that we would have to recreate a number of our sort of founding principles and change a number of traditions that exist within the legislature as a whole in order to be able to make that happen. That's a terrible situation. I mean, I don't want to be the bearer of bad tidings, but I think the structural reality of the situation is that these systems are only subject to change in as much as people are willing to push the change that's necessary. And even then, it would be very difficult because of the logic of the way that the whole thing is designed.
What if a candidate arose whose complete platform was to upset the entire structure then of, well, I mean, it's potentially possible, right? That the candidate would come forward and say me. Let's say I run for president 4 years from now and my entire platform is, I'm not doing anything, nothing's going to happen. The people have spoken by placing me in that Oval Office, right? That Congress must do this, 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 and this. We want it, you know, kind of thing. I mean, do you think that's even,
Well,
sounds
that's
extreme.
Donald Trump.
But
That's
he's
exactly
not
And it was
likely
Bernie
to get
Sanders to
into
a great
office
degree.
because Donald Trump doesn't have, I mean, it might be what he's sort of saying and what you think he's accomplishing, but so many people are not going to vote for him because I could spend the next hour telling you why I won't vote
For sure. No, right.
So,
no,
I mean,
but that's
there's too many other issues.
But that's
we talk about
well,
morality. We could.
But what my point is to say is that the candidate who says we're going to change everything, the change is not in a democratic direction, right? The change is towards an authoritarian direction.
Authoritarianism, yeah.
That's what you're saying. He's been that candidate all along.
Yeah.
And right now it's becoming more clear than ever. And because that is easy to understand. One person leading and making decisions, like at the head of a privately owned company, is understandable, and they get things done. And so it doesn't sell to anybody when you say, I'm going to go to Washington, D.C., and I'm going to change the electoral system. We're going to get rid of the Electoral College and go to a popular vote nationwide. Americans have no trust that that's going to accomplish anything. So I agree with Brandon in terms of, you could see potentially, a socialist party rise up. I think that's unlikely. I think that the Republican Party, while it's in deep trouble, I don't really see it splintering into two different parties, because if it did that, I mean, then the Democrats would just pick up every congressional. I mean, if you had a conservative, whatever the new party would be, that new party would have to somehow draw off of Democratic voters too.
Well, I guess I'm asking you to speculate. I think part of Donald Trump's problem is his own persona, and I think there's a big percentage of the electorate that doesn't want authoritarian rule, and we recognize it as that from that kind of structure. So I'll rephrase the question: is it possible that there is another route to that, and it's not just the way we vote, but a lot of the things he's saying, get money out of politics, the issues with our prison systems, 10 points, contract with America kind of thing. That's very different than one person, authoritarian process that he wants to establish, but saying this is forcing Congress to make these changes. Do you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. I think that it's far more likely that social movements could impact the platforms of the parties and change the tenor and the direction of the parties than there would be to insert more parties into the system, because that's a more direct democratic check. So when you think about those line items that you were talking about the prison system and campaign finance reform, those are areas that social movements can begin to make an impact by encouraging the parties established in the system already to change. But to make the changes necessary to make room for third parties, the quickest, dirtiest way would be to somehow get away from the notion that a party has to get 15% ahead of any debate in order to be able to be involved in the debates. And then the hope would be somehow in getting their word in edgewise, they can amass movements to get behind them. I think that's not very likely. I think what's more likely is that social movements can impact the platforms of the parties and change the directions of them in that way to kind of move in either direction, like say toward Bernie Sanders or toward Donald Trump or toward the middle. In effect, sort of turning one party on either side into two, potentially, heading in either direction depending on the desires of the population and the way the system works now. I think that's far more likely than any other kinds of large-scale constitutional structural change.
So tell me if this works as an example of that. the Tea Party didn't start a new party, but it certainly shifted a focus and maybe a platform perspective within the Republican Party.
Yeah,
I'm going to shift direction just a little bit because we brought up the issue of Trump and
Morality?
some of his moral baggage.
I was hoping we were going there.
It seems like in this election, at least for someone like me who's a relatively casual observer of what's going on, you have two candidates who are pretty haunted by moral dilemmas in their past of different kinds, but nonetheless issues which seem to really call into question the quality of their character as opposed to, say, the policy that they state that they'll support. So I guess my question is, what does this election signal about how we factor in character as a qualification for president? Maybe it's an anomaly, but do you see it as that, or do you think there's some type of shift taking place in what we expect of our leaders?
You know, I think to me, so one way to think about this is personality versus character. And this is fundamentally an election where personality has mattered, and the media is a huge factor here as well. Obviously, you might talk about Donald Trump having character, but you would mean that in a way of that he is a character, meaning that he's outrageous
like
and
a buffoon.
right. And if you look at the earliest rejectors of Donald Trump on the Republican side, and if I think of somebody like David Brooks, would be a model here, who's had some wonderful recent articles in the New York Times. They saw right away that the Republican Party has, and their Republican Party, the one they want to maintain, the one that mobilized the Christian right, effectively was a party that emphasized character, right? And the whole kind of myth of Ronald Reagan is precisely that, one of character. And so that the earliest rejectors of Donald Trump, of course, knew, because it's obvious to anybody who watches, that he has an abundance of personality that sells in a media age, and that we've become desensitized to the offensive-ness of that type of personality, which I think is one of the darker aspects of where we're at today as a country as well. But he certainly doesn't have the character that the Republican Party has emphasized, and that's why those were early rejectors, because they understood that if he were to win, then the character that has been a focus for so long, they lose that. And so it's far better from that perspective that he loses. And because they want to retain character is meaningful. And the argument there is a very strong one. And that's because Americans are basing their electoral decisions on the person that's running for office and the promises they make, but not their policy stances. When you watch this election cycle, the policy debate is as shallow as it gets. There is zero substance to it. And unfortunately, though, the substance is not focused on character; it's focused on personality. And then, of course, with the more recent scandals, with the lewd tape, and all of that, I mean, it's not surprising whatsoever. There's obviously, I would bet a lot of money that there is certainly more tapes out there. However, all of those tapes are not going to be heard because of legal difficulties with playing them, right? I mean, I assume The Apprentice probably has quite a bit of hot mic stuff, but they, of course, can't play that. So, and I think that that's the real crisis for the Republican Party. That fundamentally they've lost their brand, and in terms of the evangelical Christians. And this is why you get Glenn Beck, who's fundamentally mobilized against Donald Trump, and I just was shocked this week to read that he said that he's considered voting for Hillary Clinton. Yeah. And I don't follow him closely or anything, but I certainly remember the beginning of his career, and to think that it's 2016 and this is what he's saying, I'm just. But then I think character will continue to be a part of who we are, but the thing that I worry about is the role of the media, because the media is going to make a lot more money off personality than it will off character. And the media created Donald Trump, and the media has also created Hillary Clinton in so many ways, because the Hillary Clinton that we think of and the questions that we bring to our perception of Hillary Clinton is fundamentally a creation of the media. And so, once again, that's the biggest winner in all of this is a media that can control things through the type of coverage they give.
I have a feeling you have something to add to that.
Well, a number of things. I'm just trying to figure out sort of where to begin. I mean, the first thing that I would say is that the image that we have of politicians, and this isn't just necessarily in the mass media age. Think back to FDR being wheelchair bound and no one having a clue about that. And that is a media-related thing, I guess I should clarify. But we construct the image, right? We actively are constructing the image that we either call character and may even call personality here. And I do think that I'm not sure exactly how much that matters. In this context, it seems like this is the election of blind spots or of blinders. And I don't know exactly how this plays out in previous elections. I don't think it plays out as dramatically, but the thing that I see happening here is that everyone who's going to vote for Hillary and everyone who's going to vote for Trump, they're not getting what they like. I don't hear, besides hardcores on either side, the majority of people that I hear from in the media and talking with friends, family, and other people is that they don't accept the entirety of the character of either of these candidates. They're sort of more pitched against the other. So character be damned to some degree. I accept that Donald Trump is inappropriate, and I accept that Hillary Clinton may lie. But I'm more concerned about other things, and I think that other thing is that they don't get it. Now, I don't know what that means for future elections. We want to at least tell ourselves that the image that's portrayed to us resembles or reflects something about a person's character, but I think that's a bolt-on. I think it has to do more with sort of what strikes people to some degree from a personality standpoint, but also these days in the rejection of the other party. And so how is character playing out here? I know a lot of people who will vote for Hillary sort of holding their nose and spitting and pulling the lever, and I know people, evangelicals, who are going to vote for Trump in the same way in order to keep the other one out. What does that say for the importance of character? Not much.
So do we not care at all, not we, the electorate, not care at all about the character of our leader for our children as someone to look up to? Our leader is a leader of the free world, to how we're perceived as a world player, the president's role primarily is foreign policy, right? Not domestic policy, but foreign policy. Mm-hmm. And so, we're looking like idiots across the globe, right? I feel like we are, to any thinking person.
Yeah, the international community is watching this election closer
what
than they
the
have
heck is going on, right?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
And is it a reflection of society or just a reflection of what's going on in politics? Because I feel it's more a reflection of society, that's even acceptable to have these candidates with those kinds of issues to even be accepted, because we have nobody else who will run.
I think
are all
when
the good
the
guys
rubber meets the
running
road,
companies?
though,
Are they,
we have a presidential system. We don't have a parliamentary system that splits out head of state and head of government. We don't have a system like that. We vest both of those things into the same person, and which is very pragmatic and therefore very American, but it creates certain kinds of dilemmas like this. What happens when a person should be maintaining this sort of character and morality as a head of state, as a figurehead, projecting that image out into our world and into the international community, and sort of the practical, everyday, gritty, we got to get things done aspect, which is usually associated to the head of government. I think that Americans know, maybe not knowing in that explicit way, but at least implicitly understanding that this person is going to be both figurehead and deal maker. I think that makes the role of character and the role of head of state in American presidential politics a lot different, and perhaps in this one, a lot less important.
Do you think it's fair to say that we're making a shift from electing leaders that we might aspire to be to electing leaders that are just like me? In other words, someone that reflects us a little more and that relate to us and understand us, versus someone that we might think is on a bit of a pedestal.
Somebody we want to have a beer with. I've heard that phrase before.
Yeah,
so when George W. Bush was elected,
does that distinction make
quality.
sense?
Somebody you want to have a beer with.
Well, I think one comment we need to put out is that presidents have always been flawed individuals. to some extent, you have to be flawed to run for president, right? I mean,
Who would want that job?
Well, you have to be very ambitious. You're not the normal person.
No, no.
And you're going to sacrifice a lot. You're
Yeah.
going to sacrifice your relationship with your children to a great extent.
And leave
with
yourself
your
open to
spouse.
incredible scrutiny, obviously.
Well, but so some things have changed, however. And I think the FDR example is a fine example. I think certainly Lyndon Johnson and JFK are good examples because it's really, you could look at Gary Hart as being the changer here in terms of the private and the public. And you could think of this in terms of like a French norm of protecting the private lives of individuals, to say there's a private life of the individual and that's off limits in politics, because political action takes place in the public sphere. The courage that is required for political action is courage in the public sphere. It's about decision making and action for the state and for the government and for the people. In your private life, that's a different realm of your life, and we don't scrutinize that. And we also ask that you try not to bring it into the fore. Right? We ask that you try to keep it private. And we respect that distinction. In the United States today, what I would submit to you is that people no longer understand that distinction. And it will get worse and worse as we move forward, because I feel like young people, more so than old people, don't understand the distinction between the public and the private. Because our technology, in many ways, has allowed us to take things that should be private and make them public. And young folks are not very thoughtful of that. I would submit that we're all not very thoughtful of that. And certainly, so with the Trump tapes, for example, the thing that you see there is a person who does not understand that he's at work talking to not his best friend, but somebody who he doesn't know very well, but he thinks this is a private situation. Now, there's obviously other very deeply troubling aspects to this, because of the sexual assault,
that,
of course, because of sexual assault and everything, so there's many levels where that's deeply offensive and should be disqualifying for a candidate, right? Especially the sexual assault aspect. But this failure to distinguish between the public and the private is deeply problematic. And what it ultimately does is it makes it so that something of the myth of character that we want to bring to folks like Abraham Lincoln and FDR and JFK and others, and Lyndon Johnson and whoever else, that's not possible anymore. Because the media doesn't make any money off that, and the media has no reason to focus on that and be complicit with that myth. They used to be complicit, but they no longer are.
But shouldn't we, why shouldn't we be able to have an expectation to put someone in that office who has good moral character? I understand the public and the private being separate, but if the private is such...
Well, take the Hillary Clinton...
Give me a word.
Take the Hillary Clinton defense
Horrific, or...
of a alleged child molester, right? And I haven't watched, I know that we can watch the interview or at least listen to it online. I haven't done so. I have a good suspicion that Hillary Clinton probably did nothing that was cruel during her legal representation of that defendant, okay? But the media and the Republican campaign have made that an issue in this. And it shouldn't be an issue. Once again, I don't think that there's any evidence that she did anything cruel or wrong. She represented a defendant in our system, which is entirely appropriate in our legal system. But that just once again shows you this failure to distinguish between what's appropriate for our political election discussions and what's not. There's nothing in an individual's life. So like when you say, shouldn't we look for people with decent character? If you really think about Hillary Clinton's character, there's no huge, when you think of, so what for example has she done that's so damning in terms of her character? And I, of course, have many discussions with people about this, and they bring up, there's Whitewater, Benghazi, the emails.
And her shiftiness.
And defending Bill Clinton for sexual scandals. So.
Well, I would go so far to say that she did more than defend her husband. She actually attacked the women who made the claims, but that's going down another road. And so, yeah, but the individual candidates aside, but as far as the moral character, maybe you answered my question. I'm not sure you did. But why should we not have an expectation that the candidates running for that office should have a moral character that can be out in the open? Why should they have I understand an expectation of a private life. Privacy is privacy. But that's very different from I have a public face and public persona, and my private life is about every affair that about very negative things that we would think are negative moral character. Those are two very different ways of looking at it.
It really is.
That's what I'm getting at.
I don't know that it's that we shouldn't expect it. It's that just to some degree, or to a great degree really, what constitutes the best person for the job, and in as much as character has to do that, is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, some people are going to be like, private life is private. I want a guy who can get, or a gal who can get things done. And if they have picadillo on the side, but they're the greatest change maker that I can imagine, who can implement policies that matter to me, then whatever. I don't know if I have anything to say about that. That's more of a French, definitely historically French. That's a French norm within politics. It's also been a norm to some degree within the United States, but it's been torn away. And I think that John's point is very important here, is that in a media age that capitalizes on, media have always capitalized on what's been historically called yellow journalism, the sort of scandalous, negative sort of thing. Now it's just ubiquitous. So can we find people whose private lives are so utterly beyond reproach that most Americans will say it amounts to high character? Well, I hope so. But is that going to be the main driver is that going to be the main criterion? And I guess I would tend to be more personally in the French tradition. I guess do I care for the things that they might be doing in their private lives? Maybe not, but is that a disqualifying element to me personally? I think I'd rather have somebody who can make things happen and invoke the policies that I
Do
want
we
to
tie
see
it then,
happen.
though, to the idea of, will this person do what's right instead of what gains them more power, more prestige, more all of those things,
But again,
do what's
the
right for the
subjectivity
country?
of all of that,
Right.
so one act can be interpreted by people across the spectrum in such a way that it's like, well, was it the right thing to do?
Jimmy
Every
Carter
example
comes to
that we can think of about, or many of the examples that we can think of with regard to Hillary Clinton, I mean, a lot of this is about a subjective assessment of what she did and how people imagine it impacts upon her character, or vice versa, how her character impacted these kinds of decisions. And I know that we could very well be getting tons of people writing in because we have sort of said that she's within the mainstream norm. And there are probably a lot of people at home right now saying her character is worth nothing. She is degrading the presidency. And even though he might do that too, it's still not as bad as what she did. And so I think the subjectivity is deeply powerful in this scenario here.
The other thing I would just make a quick comment on is that as we have discussions about character, they tend to be entirely about the things that we don't want to see.
Exactly.
They tend to be about scandal. They tend to be, we want an individual who's never cheated on their spouse, who's apparently never lied, who's just a negative. And I think that is deeply troubling, because until the American people decide what the character is that they need to see as the strengths of an individual, what courage means. And I would look towards Republicans, early rejectors of Trump, to say, this is a moment where my courage is being tested, to stand apart from my party, because it's the right thing to do, and that takes precedence, right? But I bet you that they don't get a whole lot of credit at the end of the day for doing that. And so until we have an idea of what we want to see in terms of character, I don't think that this gets any better. I think we just continue to hate whoever we put up there. I mean, take John Kasich. I mean, I don't really see anything glaring about his character. He did terribly in the primary, right? So
I think the appeal of a lot of people on the left of Bernie Sanders is that he's getting closer to this notion of courage and character, consistency, we hope and we think, between his sort of public values and his private life. It's not that this doesn't matter, But when push comes to shove, and we have two people who will say have questionable character, it may not be the best situation at all in the world, but then the decision making becomes radically different. I think we would hope to find people whose public and private lives are in line with their public and private values. Everybody would want that. We would all be inspired and encouraged if we got more of that. But invariably, Bernie Sanders doesn't appeal to a heck of a lot of people on the right, and whomever might be the sort of values character person on the right isn't going to appeal the other way either. So I don't think there's some unanimous sort of list of traits that we would call great political character, except for maybe the alignment, we hope, of public and private life and values.
I think what you're saying is that when push comes to shove, the voting record shows people will choose policy over character, at Kasich being one of those examples. As much as they might admire someone of good character, if they have to choose between that person and someone else who will get them the policies they want, who is of lesser character, they'll choose the policymaker rather than the person of character.
I don't think
You're
that
saying
happened on the
support?
right whatsoever. In this election, I would say that there was a complete rejection of character, and I don't even know if it's a full full embrace of policy. It almost seems like, yes, in the end, it's policy may be trumping character, but I think Trump's personality is trumping everything.
So you meant to say trumping
use of words.
as a play on words.
I was getting there. Everybody's been doing it. But I think in the end, I would hope that policy would trump all. I mean, if we were purely rational actors here, then we should just be looking at the details of what they think should be happening in government and society, and those should be the basis, and everything else be damned. But that isn't how it works. We try to amalgamate all these things together.
But that's never going to work. It is everything I'm hearing from you too, the experts, that's probably never going to change. But what has changed is we've gone from candidates to leaders who, in my opinion, were inspiring to people who are negative. That's the biggest shift, me as a layman. I'm not an expert, but when I look at Ronald Reagan and back in those years, and you look at even just quotes, anything that came out of his mouth, the speeches that he made, they were inspiring, that we could work together as one America, all these kinds of things in the direction, and that's, I guess, where I'm coming from when I talk about their morality as one thing, but more, I want a leader that I can stand up behind and say, I'm going to follow what he said, or she said, kind of thing.
Absolutely.
To me, I want to see that in a president. It's not just about somebody who's going to get things done, or is going to take out the trash, but someone who can get everyone to work together, cross the aisle, however you want to express that. And we've lost that, I feel like. Maybe that's part of the reason why it's so depressing, or have we lost that because it's already depressing?
We've lost that because there's a whole lot of any human being that you can't see if you want to maintain that view of them.
Right.
That human beings are human beings. And if we're going to expose every part and then have them defend every part, they're not going to look so pretty. Right? It's like that Isaiah Berlin quote, out of the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight has ever been made. And so I would put it in terms of that you have to maintain a certain myth if you want your leaders to look like that.
I don't think we have time to pursue this, but I feel like we keep coming back to the impact that media now has on politics in ways it didn't before. It's this all-intrusive element that lays bare every aspect of people's lives and crafts a pursuit of image rather than a pursuit of facts necessarily. I think you said earlier, John, you talked about personality sells in the media age. It seems like everything we've talked about keeps bringing us back home to media is huge in how it's shaping every aspect of this election. Maybe it's just highlighted now more than ever, not like it hasn't had an impact before.
Yeah.
I think it is highlighted now more than ever. It's not that it wasn't important before. Media in a democratic society, they're the interlocutors. They're the ones who transmit whatever the relevant information is. Maybe it's relevant, maybe it's not. However, they see it as relevant ultimately. I mean, we've always struggled with yellow journalism and both positive and negative muckraking. I mean, this has always been with us. But the ubiquity and the social media, I mean, it's instantaneous. A 24-hour news cycle now seems horribly passé, whereas in the world before of FDR and JFK, I mean, the news cycles were weeks long. We are now instantaneously getting information from every direction, where a point is to try to get the best headline, to get the most viewers, to get to advertising content. And to think that that isn't a powerful motivator here is to deny the truth.
So is there hope? We have 2 minutes left. Is there hope? Is that what would perhaps change, is if someone emerged from the masses who was truly an inspirational character?
Yeah,
A personality, I should say, a truly inspirational personality to bring this country.
Yeah, right. The overman. And no, I see. That's what I hear there. No, I don't think that we need a truly inspiring personality to lead us. I mean, that to me, that's the most dangerous thing that I'm looking at in 2016 is that the American people are looking for a leader to lead us. And democracy is when the people lead.
Yeah.
And democracy requires the people to be adults. And when I look at America in 2016, so we can return to the original metaphor that we had here, is I see an America that in many ways, like a child, wants to tear down because they're not achieving what they want. And they don't know what they want. They don't know how to get it, but they know they want to tear down. And in a democracy, for it to work, in a democracy like ours with 320 million people, with great diversity, and we're always going to have diverse views on what good character is, you're probably not going to get the emotional satisfaction out of your republic that you might want. And it's going to be messy. And
So
It
as you
sounds
said,
so
social
utterly
movements.
bleak. I mean, as we're having this
It does.
conversation, I'm just like, oh,
You're
man,
depressing me.
It's realism v idealism. I think the reason why Bernie Sanders is the single most popular candidate running today is because he is the person who most closely embodies what we would say is an alignment between public values and a public life and private values and a private life. We want that. And we hope that we can get it, but we have to know that every human being has foibles. And in this environment, they will be exploited, if not by the media themselves, then by opposition research by the other party. And we will learn the fullness of that person's humanity. And we'll have to just deal with that fact, I think.
Well, we'll leave it at that. I was hoping we could solve all the problems of the country and the world, but we'll have to leave it at that. And before we leave you in this program, we wanted to make a special note. Our condolences to the family of Sonia, who was on the show with us maybe a year ago. Sonia Olshavy, who passed away recently, and I know Brandon and John, you both worked closely with her, and wanted to leave a few moments for you each to say something in her honor.
I could go on endlessly, frankly, about her. Sonia was a person who, if you knew her at all, you knew something about how she connected with people who she met. You knew something about how her values shape her life. And she was an inspiration to many, if not all, teachers on our campus as someone who had a unique and uncanny ability to be able to meet her students where they were, get to know them, cherish them as individuals, and keep that at the center. And that is why the NMC community is so grieving at this point with her loss. She was an inspiration to all the teachers at NMC.
Yeah, I of course, second everything Brandon said. Sonia Olshavy was just a great person. She was so supportive as a colleague. She loved her students. She loved teaching. She was excited at the beginning of every semester. Yeah. And just so caring, I think, is who she was as a person. So I was privileged to be able to work with her my entire time at NMC, and we'll miss her, of course, very, very deeply.
Thank you. And thank you for watching In Focus. We will see you next time.